Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the 11th edition of the TAISIG Talks. We are broadcasting today live from the Spoorzone in Tilburg, where our university enjoys a vibrant outpost in the Prey building. We are very honored to be invited here by our colleagues from the Mind Labs team. It has been a very warm welcome and a very teamly and collegiate collaboration thus far. So we are looking forward to more collaboration in the future. Let me introduce the TAISIG Talk team members of today. Of course, my co-host Emiel Aerts. And for technical support, we have Maarten van Alem, Puk Arends, Priscilla Wagenveld and Cora de Jonge. Our three speakers of today are Marie Postma, driving force behind TAISIG and head of the Department of Cognitive Science and AI in our School of Humanities and Digital Sciences. We have Werner Liebrechts from JETS Research and Data Entrepreneurship, and Federico Zamberlan from the Department of Cognitive Science and AI in TSHD again. We are really pleased and honored to have the three of you present in our talks this afternoon. On your screen, you can see the program for this afternoon. After my brief introduction, I will hand over to my co-host, Emiel, who will introduce Marie. After Marie, Werner will take the floor and Federico will conclude the series of speakers. Now, without further ado, over to Emiel for kicking off the first part of this event. Emiel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And let me start off by thanking you very much on behalf of the university in Tilburg that you can host this event here in the Prey building as part of Mind Labs. And we very much enjoy being here in this room. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's up to us now to give some content to this TAISIG Talk edition. And it's a truly great pleasure for me to introduce Marie Postma as the first speaker. She's an associate professor. As of 2021, she holds the position of head of the Department of Cognitive Science and Artificial Intelligence. She had previous positions as an academic director and on AI and also on data science, so and on society, I wanted. So that's the entire spectrum. Her research interests, ladies and gentlemen, are within the field of mind versus body, which is a very lengthy subject and that has been studied in depth over time. And Marie focuses on the issues of consciousness, cognitive science. And one of the central questions that she addresses is, why is it so damned hard to stay focused over the day? And just the other day, she told me the answer. She told me that she is an active practitioner of yoga, and not just yoga, but the aerial yoga. And the way she handles this, ladies and gentlemen, is by hanging upside down on a rod, and then she waits until the brain is empty. And that is the subject of the presentation today. So please, Marie, take the floor.
Thank you, Emiel, for this wonderful introduction. So the title of my talk is Can AI Have Consciousness? And the reason why I chose this topic is because, as you know, the title of this series is TAISIG Talks, and the AI in TAISIG, of course, stands for artificial intelligence. And I think that if you would ask a regular person on the street what they think about AI and what they're perhaps worried about with respect to AI, they would say that they're mainly worried about replaceability. Can AI at some point replace us humans? And then they would perhaps optimistically add that they don't think it's possible because AI is never going to have consciousness and it's never going to have emotions, two things that are actually closely related, as I'll tell you later on in this presentation. Funny enough, if you pose the same question to consciousness researchers, as they actually did in 2018 to a group of about 250 researchers at a conference, they would be more optimistic or pessimistic. They would say that at present or in the future, most likely machines, for example, robots, will have consciousness. Now, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you arguments from my own research based on perception, interoception, and emotions, particularly the emotion of awe, why I think that the way, at least the way we work with AI nowadays and the way we build AI systems means that they will not have consciousness. So maybe they can, but not the way they are designed at the moment. So let's start with perception. Nowadays, most AI systems that I know of are built in a bottom-up way. That means that there is sensory information coming in from the environment, and that sensory information is processed, and then there is some output, some kind of series of representations that's outputted. Human perception is assumed to work in the opposite way, namely top-down. So that means that the sensory information that's coming in is actually not the starting point. And we can very clearly see that when we consider bistable perceptual phenomena. What are these phenomena? Well, I think that when you think about it, you've all heard of some examples. For example, the issue of blue versus yellow dress that the internet was living with some years ago. In my own work, I focused on auditory bistable perceptual phenomena, and these are phenomena in the auditory domain, where our perception, our interpretation of what we hear wavers between two possible interpretations. I want to say that the research that we did here goes back a very long time. Like anything that's good, I think, goes back to Herman von Helmholtz, who had a very lively discussion at the time about this particular phenomenon that's referred to as missing fundamental. And we are here close to Philips, and our host today, Emil Aerts, has himself very close connections to Philips. This phenomenon was also examined in the famous NAT labs in Eindhoven. So in this bistable perceptual phenomenon, listeners are presented with a series of complex tones where the missing fundamental, the lowest frequency in the complex tone, is missing. And our perceptual apparatus then has two choices. It can either consider the lowest harmonic that's actually present to be the pitch, the perceptual pitch, so the melody that's created by the series of these tones, or it can search for the greatest common divisor in the complex tone and thereby derive the fundamental frequency. Now, for some time, researchers thought that whether we go in with the one or the other solution depends on individual differences. So they talked about spectral listeners and fundamental listeners. Herman von Helmholtz was, I think, a fundamental listener, and the person he had a discussion with was the other kind. But actually, a lot of research in the recent years showed that we are all both types of listeners, and whether we choose one or the other interpretation greatly depends on the context in which the stimulus is presented, the frequency with which we already engaged in some kind of calculation like the one that we actually need to perform, and also in training. Training matters here, so feedback that we might receive. So what this shows, what bistable perceptual phenomena show, is that just like the eye is not innocent, the ear is not innocent either. We perceive what we think we should perceive. Our experience determines our perception. The second example, also from the perceptual domain, comes from our research on perceptual decoupling in the context of mind wandering. And you may know that most of the time we are actually perceptually decoupled from our sensory environment. Our brain considers the sensory environment to be highly redundant, very, very predictable. And our conscious processes are turned towards inward stimuli. Some estimates say that this happens about 50 to 70% of our waking moments. And of course, we are not really concerned with our sensory environment when we're deep asleep. Now, what we showed in our work, and this is research of Mariana Diaz da Silva, one of my PhD students who has done wonderful work on this topic. We can actually observe when people are perceptually decoupled from their environment, when we consider their behavioral markers like eye tracking or mouse tracking. We look at the movement of their hand transmitted to us by the computer mouse. And we see that, for instance, with respect to the number of saccades or the number of blinks, when people are perceptually disengaged, these numbers increase. And I should add that this is not during reading tasks, because reading tasks are very specific. With respect to mouse tracking and also object tracking, so when we measure their fine motor movements, perceptual decoupling to some degree influences their performance. And we can very clearly see in the brain that it also influences markers in the brain that we can measure with EEG, both in terms of oscillations in the alpha, beta, delta, and theta power, and also with respect to ERPs. Okay, so that was perception. Now for the next two topics that are crammed on the slides together because they are actually related. The conscious experience that we have of ourselves, who I am as myself, is anchored in interoceptive processes. These are processes that determine something about the state of our body. They actually help us keep ourselves alive, all the collections of cells in our body. So they are related to autonomic, hormonal, visceral, but also immunological signals in our body that are very often unconscious or subconscious, but that are translated into conscious events by what we call feelings. So mental events that we call feelings are actually representations of these processes. There is a very close link between interoception, so what we think is happening in our body, and what we call proprioception, and that is actually the movement of our body in space, so where our limbs are and how our actions are executed. And we did some work on this topic together with another PhD student of mine, Lisa Rombout, who's an expert on different aspects of interoception and distinguishing between sensibility, awareness, accuracy, and different ways to measure these traits. So if we construct AI systems that don't have as their primary purpose to keep themselves alive, so they actually are not engaged in this constantly changing process that should lead to some kind of stability that we refer to as homeostasis, we are only focusing on a part of the conscious processes. The human intelligence is not just represented in the brain, as we tend to think. It's also collected from signals that are in the body, and the body plays a very important role. So there is an interoceptive nervous system that actually has very specific properties that are somewhat different from the central nervous system. They're closely linked, they interact with each other, they communicate with each other. But that's not something that we typically see in AI systems. Now, emotions are another aspect of being human that people sometimes think could never be attached to artificial intelligence. And as I told you, given that we think of the interoceptive processes being represented as mental events, as feelings, we very clearly see a relation between these two concepts. Now, what I think is very difficult to imagine is an AI system that would experience a very particular emotion that I'm interested in, and that's the emotion of awe. The reason why I'm interested in it is because I think it's the most fun emotion to think about when you're a scientist. It is an emotion that's very closely linked to the experience of making a scientific discovery. So as scientists, let's hope that we feel that emotion often. We can also experience it in other circumstances. For instance, during birth of our child, that's a very overwhelming experience that might actually have the same impact on the experience of selfhood, on our self-consciousness. There are also other stimuli that have been used in the past to evoke this emotion, and very often they are linked to vastness. So there's probably some kind of visual sensory input that plays an important role here. And the most frequently used stimulus that we also use in our own research is the overview effect. This is the effect that was first reported by astronauts that went into space, and then they viewed the Earth, and they said, this tiny blue marble hanging in the emptiness of the space, of the vastness of the visual stimulus, had a transformative effect on them. So these all experiences are transformative experiences. Maybe you had the experience of going somewhere high up in the mountains and looking down into the valley. That might be an experience that would also have all-like properties. Now, what's interesting about this emotion is that it actually disrupts our self-referential processing. It really leads to a fundamental change in self-consciousness that may have lasting effects. And that is what has been described for the overview effect, where the astronauts who experienced it said that after that, they had the feeling of feeling very small, being connected to others, other human beings, but other beings also on the planet. Also a particular need of accommodating this experience, so also transforming our beliefs about the world and the beliefs about ourselves in the world. And a similar experience can be also achieved by psychedelics, which is something that our third speaker today is an expert on and may tell you much more about. So in conclusion, what I want to say is, or my argument today would be that given how we design AI systems currently, they miss a number of crucial elements that define human consciousness. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but probably before we actually start designing other types of systems, we're not going to achieve what we are currently doing with our human consciousness. I mentioned the top-down rather than bottom-up processing of sensory information, as demonstrated, for instance, by stable perceptual phenomena and the fact that we are most of the time perceptually decoupled from our environment. I talked about the goal of consciousness, what some people assume is actually the evolutionary purpose of consciousness. Why is it useful for us to have it? Well, it is to keep our organism alive, and that involves monitoring and interpreting a lot of internal processes, interoceptive processes, that may then be manifested by what we call feelings as mental representations of these processes. And finally, I talked about the disruption of these higher level representations, particularly as they pertain to our self-consciousness, how we view ourselves, by particular perceptual experiences, such as the awe-evoking stimuli. And if you don't believe me yet, I prepared an extra slide, but I don't think I have time for that. And that is on group effects, something that we did work on, where we consider emotions and actions in social context, and where we can observe that very often the actions we perform and the emotions we experience are determined by the social circle around us, particularly if we're somehow affiliated to the members of the social circle, and how this is actually this process is supported by mutual gaze and proximity, where the self-other boundary might be blurred. Now, at the end of my talk, I would like to thank these four wonderful ladies, PhD students that I had the greatest pleasure of collaborating with in the past years, and I hope to collaborate with in the future. Mariana Diaz da Silva, Alexandra Sierra Rativa, Lisa Rombout, and Anna Broers. Thank you.